I absolutely agree with you. I've watched all of them mostly for the podcast, and just I don't know, it's like watching a train wreck. Um, and I just as a sort of semiotician, someone who really likes to look at where popular culture is going with native images. They've all been interesting and disgusting at the same time. And I'm seeing now um, ads for the final season of Yellowstone on TV, and you know, it's it just occurred to me last night that, of course, the final season is debuting during Native American or Indigenous Peoples Month, and and then that other one, 1923, the latest in the series, of course, has a a a segment of it, or a storyline that's all about boarding school. The young woman who, and it's all trauma porn. I mean, it's worse than porn. And I know you have a lot to say, and we've said a lot also about Sheridan's treatment and Costner's treatment of women, Native women, but women in general in all of their shows and movies. And that one in particular is really egregious with the violence and with the trauma, and um, so I'd love to hear your take on that also, and in particular as also in the news either follows popular culture or vice versa, and we just had Biden apologizing, first president to apologize for boarding school, and immediately, of course, all Native activists and leaders, academics, as well as grassroots leadership. Apologies, just an apology. You have to back it up with real action. And so it's interesting that the boarding school storyline in that is sort of it started when Deb Haaland started the project about boarding schools. What are they going to do with it now?
Oh my gosh, so much. So very much to say. So, I only watched part of 1886 when we recorded a podcast on it. I refuse to watch Yellowstone unless I absolutely have to. I've watched other things that Taylor Sheridan has written and directed and produced. So I watched something called Lioness, which is on Paramount Plus, um, which is not part of like the Yellowstone. What do they call those? The Yellowstone family, or what's that word that they use in film and television?
Franchise.
Franchise. That's not part of the Yellowstone franchise. There really isn't much about Native people in that. But Lioness actually reminds me a lot of Sicario, which he also wrote. And we talked a bit about Sicario in relationship to 1886 when we were recording that podcast. So I've watched Wind River. I finally watched Wind River earlier this year because I also refused to watch that for a really long time. So I can definitely comment on the way that in like Sheridan's imagination, what is like the narrative role that Native women play, and it is very much like Native women who are in distress. It's kind of like a damsel in distress, but then refracted through the creepy MMIW lens, because I think he thinks of himself perhaps as like a friend of Native people or something. And so he's obviously very obsessed with Native people because, minus the ones that I just talked about, like Sicario or Lioness or like some of these other things that he's done in television, he's like very, very interested in telling the story of Indians, but the way that Native women and even white women, right, figure into his work, it's there's a lot of violence that happens to women in his writing and in the worlds that he creates, and they don't even. It's not even necessarily damsel in distress. They just endure a lot of violence. They're not even necessarily rescued the way that they would be like when we were talking about Last of the Mohicans last time in this like captivity narrative. It's not even necessarily a captivity narrative. It's just like Taylor Sheridan's weird version of what frontier violence, I guess, looked like when it came to women. And it's very gratuitous, I would say. It's very gratuitous. And so the choice, right, to cast a young Native actress who is supposed to be playing a Native woman, but who is in fact not, right? is not indigenous, if that's what you were referencing earlier, Liza. That also seems par for the course given his really terrible politics around Native feminism, or just like his, I don't know, him giving even the remotest shit about like, what Native women might actually have to say about these stories that he's telling, or about these actual histories. And I'll just say one more thing. I mentioned this earlier. Yellowstone takes place in a contemporary moment, right? It's supposed to be taking place in like the here and now. But when I think of the two spin-offs from Yellowstone, 1886 and 1923, I think about two things, two pivotal moments in the genocidal history of federal Indian policy. I think about allotment. I think about the General Allotment Act, and that the liquidation was oh gosh, how many acres were liquidated during the General Allotment Act? Indigenous land. It's the largest liquidation or theft of land in world history in the 1880s. This is happening in the 1880s when this show is taking place. And then in 1923 is the height of like the most brutal form of assimilation policy for Native people in the United States. So I guess he talks about boarding schools or whatever in 1920, the show 1923. And of course, that is happening at that time. Carlisle is founded in between allotment, kind of between 1886 and 1923. But most of those really horrific stories about the brutality of boarding schools come out of this particular era of the history of boarding schools. And of course, there are other types of assimilation policies that are just completely decimating Native people and Native nations at this time. And so there's this like subtext of genocide, right, and settler colonialism through all of his work. I would argue even the work that's not specifically about like would be considered a Western or a neo-Western, or have Indians in it. But it's never it's never approached consciously in any of his shows. There's no even like moral kind of standing. There aren't lines that any of the characters say about this history of genocide or settler colonialism. It seems very much just part. It's not even a settler unconscious, I would say. It just feels such straightforward settler attitude about American history, and what it means to be American. And that is why I hate it so much. And the reason why Yellowstone, and I'll ask you this question because I have my own thoughts about this. Maybe I'll kick it to you, Liza. Why do you think why do you think Yellowstone is such a popular show? Like one of the most popular shows in the history of television. I mean, I have an inkling as to why.
I would love to know what you all think about what makes Yellowstone so popular. I mean, I said in the piece, and I kind of still stand by this. I think one aspect that we can all agree, even the three of us, Montana is pretty. Montana is really pretty. It is hard to take a bad picture of Montana. I mean, just about anybody could point any type of camera in any direction. It's going to look pretty good. So there's that. There's that. Montana is like beautiful. I mean, there's a lot of places in the US that are beautiful, right? And so Montana is beautiful, but I don't think that's why. I don't think that's all that's going on there. I mean, I called my piece "We Don't Share Land Here," and you were speaking about values, and I felt in terms of choosing that particular quote that Kevin Costner utters when there's these Chinese tourists on his land, as they've stepped off this tourist bus. I feel that kind of captures the narrative kind of essence of the entire show. And it's almost like the past doesn't matter because in this present, you just have natives and you have whites. And they have no values because in a sense, they have the same values. They all just have land and they all want to keep their land. And that's not, the show sort of purports that that's not a value, that that's just human nature. And you don't need to explain the past. So I was really shocked when they came out with 1886 because I was like, the past really doesn't matter to this show. So in terms of why it's so popular, I think that the scenery is beautiful. I think there is like decent character development. But again, I do not think this is why most people like it. I mean, I'm getting closer to why actually most people like it. And I don't think most people would say this is why they like it. I think they would say Montana is beautiful. The scenery is beautiful. There's good character development. I think that there's a lot going on here with white supremacy and hypermasculinity and toxic masculinity. It's really a show about strong white men and their competition with each other. Yes, Native people are there. I don't feel that Native people are kind of essential to this story. I feel it's a story about this white this wealthy, very, very wealthy white patriarch who's a strong man. And I think white American men really identify with that. They want to be that. And that has nothing to do with the beauty of Montana. And that has nothing to do with good writing or character development. That almost doesn't even need dialogue. That's like a look. It's something that's evoked, right? And they love seeing these white guys square off with each other. And it's almost like the fact that these powerful white guys on set have beef with each other and have physical fights with each other, it's almost like this makes them that much more attractive, I think, to white men today. Like Sheridan has had fights with the actor who plays Rip. He's had physical fights with the actor who plays Rip. You know, the guy with the big thick mustache, Sam Houston. Like, remember during the pandemic, he was like refusing to go into the award ceremonies because he's like, I'm not wearing a mask. I mean, white dudes love that shit. They eat that shit up. They're like, that's my guy. That's a real man. But what do you all think?